Hello. So in this video, I want to go over some important terminology that will help you better understand what Kripke is trying to say in Naming a Necessity. So let's begin with possible worlds. So possible worlds are useful theoretical tools or theoretical entities that are used whenever analyzing counterfactual situations or when we use modal terminology. So, for example, when we say things like, it's possible that Hector could have been a billionaire, or it's if Hector were born to billionaire parents, then Hector would have been a billionaire. So these types of statements are modal statements in that whether the statements are true or false doesn't have anything to do with the way things really are, but with these kind of possible scenarios or possible situations. And we can also say things like, it is necessary that, for instance, when we say it is necessary that if Hector exists, Hector is a human, or necessarily all humans have human DNA, those are also modal terms. And as I was mentioning, whether or not these statements are true or false have nothing to do with the way the world is here. But we know that some of these statements are true or false. We can assess these statements. For instance, we know that it's true that if Hector were born to billionaire parents, then maybe it is likely that Hector would have been a billionaire himself, or Hector would have been a billionaire by default. We can more or less understand that that would be true, even though in fact it's not the case that Hector was born to billionaire parents or that he is a billionaire. So the reason or the way in which we go about assessing whether this is true or false is not by looking at our own current state of affairs, but by looking at other possible state of affairs, what philosophers call possible worlds, where possible worlds are ways the world could have been, right? So a possible world is not an actual current state of affairs. What we call a current state of affairs is the actual world. The actual world is the way things, really are right now. So now there's a lot of debate in metaphysics as to the existential status of possible worlds. So individuals like David Lewis believe that possible worlds are actual concrete entities, the way that the actual world is an actual thing. But we're not really going to spend much time in discussing the status of possible worlds here because we're not concerned about the status or metaphysical status of possible worlds. Instead, we're concerned with modal language, sentences that use modal terminology like possibility, necessity, and contingency. So for our purposes, we're going to think of possible worlds just as theoretical entities, tools that just help us better understand and analyze the truth conditions of these modal statements. The more important modal statements or notions that we're going to be encountering in Kripke's Naming Necessity are the notions of possibility, necessity, and contingency. And we're going to be thinking of these notions as properties that propositions possess. So we can say something like a proposition is possibly true under the conditions that there is some possible world that makes that proposition true, or it's true at some possible world, let's just say. So for example, the proposition that Hector is a billionaire. We know that in fact Hector is not a billionaire, but it's possible that I could be a billionaire. There's nothing logically incoherent or inconsistent about me being a billionaire. So the way we would analyze that in, say, modal logic or in modal terminology is by assessing that or saying that, well, the reason it's true that it's possible that Hector's a billionaire is because there is some possible world at which that proposition is true. When we use the term necessity and say a proposition is necessarily true, that means that it's true in every possible world, right? Or every possible world in which that proposition could be true. So for instance, if we say something like bachelors are unmarried males, that proposition is not only true, it is necessarily true, right? It's necessarily true that regardless of which possible world we are talking about, it's going to be true that if we identify a bachelor, that bachelor is going to be an unmarried male. Another proposition that is necessarily true is that every entity is identical to themselves, right, and not to other individuals. So, for instance, Hector is identical to Hector and to no one else in the sense of numerical identity. I'm not identical to, say, Barack Obama, right? We're numerically distinct individuals. So the proposition Hector is numerically identical to himself is necessarily true. It doesn't mean that I exist in every possible world, but if I did exist at some possible worlds, in some counterfactual situations, it would be necessarily true that I am identical to myself and to nothing else. And lastly, we have a contingency. So a proposition is contingently true if it is true at the actual world, say in our current state of affairs. So for example, at the time that I'm recording this, it is like 90 degrees outside. So there's not a cloud in sight, not a rain. There's no rain. So if I say it is cloudy outside of my house, the proposition that is expressed by that statement, that it is cloudy outside of Hector's house, that proposition is true, but it's only contingently true because it's possible that it could have been false. It's possible that there could have been a blizzard outside or rain or clouds or what have you, right? So these are the important modal notions that we will be using or coming across in Kripke's naming and necessity. The terms a priori and a posteriori, these are Latin for, a priori is Latin for knowledge before or apart from experience or something along those lines. A posteriori is Latin for knowledge after or on the basis of experience. These are also taken to be modal terms, but they're taken to be modal terms not as they apply to propositions, so they wouldn't be properties of propositions, but they are epistemic notions, or they're properties as they apply to our either ability to know something or not know something, or our epistemic states, if you will. So for example, I know that all triangles have 3 angles. I know that a priori. I don't know that a posteriori. In other words, I know that on the basis of, the logical implications and concepts of triangularity and having 3 angles. I don't have to go all over the world to verify that every single triangle in the world or the universe, let's say, has 3 angles. I know that for a fact a priori because I just have to kind of sit down and reason about it. So I don't need experience to come to know that. So this is why my knowledge that triangles have 3 angles is knowable a priori. It's before or apart from experience. The notion of a posteriori, however, is knowledge that we acquire on the basis of experience or after experience. So for example, I know that it is sunny outside. I know that it is, what month is this? August, based on experience, right? If I was locked in my room and I had no windows anywhere, I wouldn't be able to know that it is sunny outside. I wouldn't be able to know that it is August this month on the basis of just merely sitting down and thinking about it and reasoning my way to this knowledge. I would have to go out into the world and verify it somehow, either empirically through my senses or through testimony or something along those lines. So that's the difference between a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. So it used to be the case before Kripke that many individuals or philosophers just assumed that when we use the term necessity and a priori, that these were interchangeable or synonyms for the same thing, and the same applied to contingency and a posteriori. So I mentioned just earlier that these are different concepts. Necessity and contingency and possibility, these are modal terms that apply to propositions, whereas a prioriness, a posteriorness, these are epistemic notions that apply to epistemic states, states of knowledge or mental states of sorts. But prior to Kripke, people just kind of conflated all these things together. And part of the reason for that was, well, the influence of Immanuel Kant, for one, but also it just kind of made sense that when we talked about certain propositions, say the proposition that all bachelors are unmarried males, right? That seems to be a necessary truth, and the only way we could come to know that is a priori, right? We actually know that all bachelors are unmarried males, even though we haven't gone all over the world to verify that every bachelor is unmarried, right? I don't need to go all over the world to know that this is true. I just need to understand the concept of bachelorhood and the concept of being an unmarried male and just analyze that here in my room to know that all bachelors are unmarried males. So there's good reason for why people thought that these were interchangeable notions. The same applied for a posteriori knowledge and contingent truths, right? So take the proposition, it rained in Los Angeles on June 12, 1985. Well, I mean, I don't know that. I could know that. I come to find that out. The way I could come to find that out is by, looking at history books, or maybe looking at the LA Times to look for an article on that date to see the weather report, something along those lines. It's going to require some kind of empirical work, empirical verification. Um, and in addition to that, the proposition expressed by this statement is a contingent truth. So even if it is true, or were true, that it rained in Los Angeles on this date, it could have been otherwise, right? So, but again, the notions of a posteriori and contingency seem to be interchangeable because, well, contingent propositions can only be, or they appear to only be known a priori, and necessary propositions appear to only be knowable a priori. But one of the things that Kripke argues for in Naming a Necessity is that, in fact, no, there are some necessary truths, some propositions that are necessarily true that can only be known a posteriori, and there are also some contingent truths that can only be known a priori. Right? And so this development in Kripke's Naming a Necessity was very monumental because it brought apart these notions that for a long period of time since Immanuel Kant, people conflated, or philosophers conflated it as being the same thing. Right? Now, we're not going to spend that much time with those particular arguments. His argument for the necessary a posteriori truths and contingent a priori truths, we can talk about these in discussion, but it's just important to understand that some of the arguments that he is providing against descriptivism in general also are demonstrate that these concepts can be separated, if you will. Okay, so that ends this video.